The fog continues to roll in. The dark of night deepens until all is black. Ahead, a rocky shoal beckons where certain tragedy awaits. Your ship plows forward, pushed by the storm. Just as your hope begins to subside, you see it, the light from the lighthouse that guides you to safety, faithfully kept by the Lightkeeper.
Hi friends, welcome to Lessons from the Lightkeeper, a special leadership development series on the Ed Leader podcast. Through this series, based on the book Talent is Never Enough by John Maxwell, we've worked through each lesson. John Maxwell calls them choices. William Jennings Bryan said, "Destiny is not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. It's not a thing to be waited for, it's a thing to be achieved." Our destiny is ours to choose. We can choose to have our work, our destiny, lit by our belief. We can choose to have it energized by our passion and activated by our initiative. We can choose to have it directed by our focus and positioned through our preparation. We can choose to have it centered through our practice and sustained through our perseverance. We can choose to have this work brightened by our courage and expanded by our own teachability. We can choose to have it protected by our character and influenced by the relationships that we have professionally and personally. My friends, to do so requires an emphasis on today's lesson. Responsibility strengthens the light. Stephen Covey says, look at the word responsibility. Responsibility, the ability to choose your response. Highly proactive people, he says, recognize that responsibility. They do not blame circumstances, conditions, or conditioning for their behavior. Their behavior is a product of their own conscious choice based on values, rather than a product of their conditions based on feeling. I really think Stephen Covey's on to something when he says that we have the ability to choose our response, and it is that is our responsibility. If we desire to be successful in this work and making a difference for children and others and spending our professional lives changing the world, we must choose responsibility. The strength of responsibility is that responsibility provides the foundation of success. Responsibility handled correctly leads to more responsibility. Responsibility maximizes both our ability and our opportunities. Responsibility, over time, builds a solid reputation. The longer we know a person who lacks responsibility, the less we trust them. Conversely, the longer we know a person who is very responsible, the more we trust them. Sir Winston Churchill said, "The price of greatness is responsibility." Now, in my profession, education, we're not in it for personal greatness, but we are in it to make a great change in the world for the better. The price of being able to impact that change or to be a part of that change process is responsibility. For us to grow in the area of responsibility, John Maxwell says we have to start wherever we are. He noted that Aristotle observed we become what we are as persons by the decisions that we ourselves make. We're a product of our decisions. Responsibility is always a choice, and only we can make it for ourselves. No one else can choose for me to be responsible. I have to choose that. In our previous lesson, we talked about relationships influence the light. Well, my friends, part of responsibility is choosing our friends and our teammates wisely. Taking responsibility for surrounding ourselves with folks who lift us up and not tear us down. And certainly if you've not had the opportunity to listen to that lesson, I would certainly encourage you to do so, because the two are intertwined in this moment as we think about taking responsibility for the relationships in our personal and professional lives. Responsible leaders don't blame others. They don't make excuses. They don't look to others to blame. They just focus on the present and do their very best. I can't tell you how many times I've watched the lesson of responsibility in leaders take place over and over. There's a temptation in our society to blame something else other than ourselves. And in every instance, when we do that, we lose credibility within our team and beyond. But for those leaders who take responsibility, who say, this is my bad, and who then talk about how they're going to make sure it never happens again, it actually grows trust in that leader. Because they've clearly understood what went wrong. They're going to do something about it. Let's move on. But the person who tries to hide behind blame or shifting the focus to someone else, that's seen through pretty quickly. Responsibility has 4 core lessons for us all. The first is to recognize that gaining success means practicing self-discipline. Viktor Frankl said, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and only he can answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. To parse that down, I believe that what Frankl is saying is the meaning of life is how we choose to live the life we've been given. We could choose to be lazy. We could choose to not employ each of the choices or lessons we've talked through this leadership development series. Or we could choose to be responsible, to really have an incredible work ethic when it comes to growing ourselves. And in that, define the meaning of life for ourselves, because the way we live our life defines the meaning of life for each of us. John Weston says, I've always tried to live with the following simple rule. Don't do what you wouldn't feel comfortable reading about in the newspaper the next day. I really do think that's the bottom line for leaders, particularly ed leaders. Everything we do is looked at under a microscope. If you don't want to read about the decision you're about to make in the newspaper, don't go forward with that decision. But if you believe if it's going to be in the newspaper, it reflects positively on the organization and moves you forward in your ability to impact students' lives, then that's probably the right decision to make. The second major lesson in the area of responsibility is what you start, finish. John Maxwell says there's 2 kinds of people in the world, those who do and those who might. Responsible people follow through. We know talented people, great leaders, who for whatever reason choose not to engage and wind up being left behind because they haven't taken responsibility to follow through. The third is to know when others are depending on you. The first step in making yourself the kind of person others can depend on is being dependable. If you say you're going to be someplace, be there. If you say you're going to do something, do that. Show responsibility in being on time or early to meetings. Show responsibility by beating deadlines and not being the person who has to get a reminder email because you forgot to send something in. Remember, others are depending on you, so be dependable. Know that when others are depending on you, you have to take the focus off yourself in terms of when you're looking at your to-do list and there's something that may be more enjoyable than some other item, but you know the one that's not quite as enjoyable is key and crucial for someone else to be able to do their work. Know they're depending on you. Be responsible. Do that first. Because being a part of a team means that we work together. Don't expect others to step in for you. You must take personal responsibility, Jim Rohn says. He goes on to say you cannot change the circumstances, the seasons, or the wind, but you can change yourself. You can change yourself. We can take responsibility for ourselves. And it's so very crucial. John Maxwell says we must make tough decisions and stand by them. In the book, Talent is Never Enough, he tells a story about President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the story comes from his service as a general. And I'd like to share with you directly from the book. He says a general from American history whose reputation continued to grow was Dwight D. Eisenhower. In fact, his reputation became so strong that it got him elected president. One reason was his willingness to take responsibility for his decisions. During World War II, Eisenhower was responsible for planning the D-Day invasion of Normandy, France. Giving the okay for the assault was a painful decision, one he knew that would lead to the deaths of many servicemen. Yet he also knew that if it was successful, it would be a pivotal point in the war against the Nazis. Eisenhower handwrote a press release that would be used in the event of the invasion's failure. Our landings have failed, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and this place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Eisenhower had determined that he would take responsibility for whatever happened. That mindset earned the admiration of his fellow officers, his soldiers, and citizens alike. If we place ourselves in Eisenhower's shoes in that moment, he's making this decision that could potentially turn around the war, and of course it did in a very positive way. But prior to it ever being started, prior to D-Day being launched, he wrote out the press release in case it failed. And in the press release, he took responsibility for the decision. That's so very powerful. And I'm afraid it's missing too often in leadership, taking responsibility for decisions. When that moment comes, when a hard decision is required, leaders, true leaders, stand up, share the decision, and take responsibility for it. And they don't waffle. They don't go back and forth. They share, here is the decision I'm making for these reasons. I believe it to be best. And if it doesn't work out, it's on me. And in that moment, we inspire confidence in those we serve with. They appreciate someone who will take responsibility. Truly, that's leadership. Finally, as John Maxwell ends this teaching on responsibility, he encourages us to live beyond ourselves. President John F. Kennedy said, "For those to whom much is given, much is required." John Maxwell pulled out a challenge that was given to the 1992 graduating class of the University of South Carolina by Chief Judge Alexander Saunders, the Chief Judge of the South Carolina Court of Appeals. Judge Saunders said to the graduates, "As responsibility is passed to your hands, it will not do, as you live the rest of your life, to assume that someone else will bear the major burdens, that someone else will demonstrate the key convictions, that someone else will run for office, that someone else will take care of the poor, that someone else will visit the sick, protect civil rights, enforce the law, preserve culture, transmit value, maintain civilization, and defend freedom. You must never forget that what you do not value will not be valued, that what you do not remember will not be remembered, that what you do not change will not be changed, that what you do not do will not be done. You can, if you will, craft a society whose leaders, business and political, are less obsessed with the need for money. It's not really a question of what to do, but simply the will to do it. Often in this work that you and I are engaged in, we see the path forward, but it takes the courage to take that first step, the initiative to take that first step, and ultimately the responsibility, understanding that if we don't, who will? If you want your life to be a magnificent story, if you want your work to be an incredible story, then realize that you are the author of that story. Every day, you have the chance to write a new page in that story. My friends, thank you for the story you're writing. Thank you for the difference you're making in countless lives. Thank you for taking responsibility, my friends. Keep shining the light.
Thank you for listening to the Ed Leader Podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast and consider leaving a review with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts so that we may continue to grow the Ed Leader community. We hope that you have enjoyed your time with Dr. Jackson. Until next time.